Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at our P6 practice, and specifically, we are going to focus in on how to import the contents of a CSV file or comma-separated values into an array of structures. Now, this particular P6 practice may be different from your current P6 practice, but ideally, pieces of this project may be used in other projects, and specifically the idea of being able to import the contents of a file into either parallel arrays or an array of structures. Now, to begin with, you'll notice here that my function accepts a file name, and the idea here is it's going to ultimately update an array of product properties and then keep track of the number of elements in the array using the address of an integer. And a couple other things to note here is that we have defined a constant and max that will be used to cap the total number of structures in our array. This will technically be different from the used number of structures in our array. And the reason is that we're still working with static memory declarations. In other words, in our main, we will have a couple of arrays of structures. Now, before we go any further, let's take a look at the file itself. You notice that I have an ID, a name, a type, a description. Notice the description field has a semicolon in there. The idea is that I want to have an additional delimiter to be able to break up the description, perhaps into its own fields in a later process. The price and the quantity. And in each case, I've tried to keep the number of characters in a field relatively consistent so that if you notice then back in our P6 practice, then that our ID is capped at 10 characters, the name 20, the type 20, the description 50, and so on. The idea here is that we need to check that our individual fields are not longer than the allocations in the structure. And so if we go back here real quick, you'll see that our ID has 5 characters in it. Remember that we would probably want to leave an additional character for the end of string because it'll probably be easier for us to consider these as strings as opposed to character vectors. And in this case, my ID has 10, which should be enough. And you want to take just a second to make sure that you have enough space allocated in each of the fields in your structure. So once again, we are going to focus on the import products. We want to be able to read in our products.csv. We want to then update this array of structures. So let's get started. First thing we want to do is jump down to our function implementation. We're going to sort of bounce back and forth between the variable declarations and our code. We'll probably forget a variable that we need and we'll need to add it, but at the very least, we can probably guess that we need to have some sort of index variable. Arguably, we could call it, for instance, n-index. Again, we'll see. We may or may not actually need this. We will also need a file input pointer. We'll definitely need that because we're ultimately going to have to open our file and we need to be able to have a way of storing that pointer. And at this point, let's just go ahead and get started. The first thing that we want to do is to check to make sure that our input arguments are valid. Again, there's a couple of things that we can do along these lines, but the very first one that we want to do is we want to check that our file name itself, that variable, is not null. And we can combine this now with our string length function. And we want to make sure that we have a valid file name. And arguably the smallest file name that would involve the .csv file extension, including the period and a single character for the name of the file, would be 5 characters long. And so in other words, what we want to do is we want to make sure that the string length is greater than or equal to 5. So what we'll do is we'll check to see if it is less than 5. If either of these two conditions are met, we print an error that says invalid file name. And then more importantly, we want to say results are then going to be equal to exit failure. Now, at this point, we'll go ahead and put our else in just so we have that branch. And then let's consider then the next thing that we want to check. We want to also make sure that for some reason the user did not pass the import results as a null pointer. And so in this case, if it is equal, or rather, I've got my logic wrong here, and my apologies. If my file name is equal to null, and if my import results are equal to null, in both cases, we have a problem here. We again want to provide a error message. So print F error invalid array. And again, here, we're just simply going to say results are equal to exit failure. Now, we could also do the same thing with our int pointer, or the address of our integer. But again, that's probably less likely that the user is going to be doing that, just simply because of the fact that it is a single integer. However, we can always go ahead and check, and that we will simply see here, else if our n is equal to null, and then again, print F error invalid n. And at this point, we've probably covered everything we need to as far as validation of our input arguments. Because we are still dealing with static memory declarations, then we can't do anything if, for instance, our import results are equal to null. And at this point, then, in our else branch is where we want to try to open the file. And so in this case, we'll say input is equal to fopen of our file name, whatever that was provided to us. And we want to open it for reading because we are not intending to modify this at all. And then in this case, then we want to check to see if our input is equal to null. And if it is, then again, provide some sort of error back to user, failed to open. And in this case, since we've got a file name, we can actually tell the user what file we failed to open by simply using the %s placeholder and passing to it the argument of the file name. Again, we'll have our results are equal to exit failure. But under the else branch, effectively is where we were successful at opening the file. Probably the first thing that we need to remember to do is to close the file. And then what we can do is we can start reading through each of the rows in the CSV file and start putting the individual fields in their appropriate location. Now, at this point, we should probably go ahead and assign 0 to our value for n. The reason being is that this is probably as close as we're going to get to successfully starting to read in the values, and it's probably an appropriate point to go ahead and initialize our n. Now, arguably, you could do it at the beginning of the function, basically just simply reset that as soon as you come into the function. But then if, for instance, you have not successfully passed a valid file name, is there any point in resetting the n? Again, there's room for discussion here. Now, with our while loop, we have two conditions that we wish to check. The first one is going to be that our index, or n, is going to be less than our n max. So we can simply say while our n is less than our n max, and the results of our fscanf pointed at our input file pointer And I'm going to do something a little strange here. I'm just going to leave my input arguments as double quotes for my format spec. And then we also need to think about the columns that we're going to be reading out of the file. In other words, while all this is not equal to end of file. Now, I am technically writing broken code here, and I'm doing it this way for a reason, because what I want to do now is I want us to take a look at our products.csv. And again, we can split the screen, whichever way works for you. I'm going to leave the CSV file here so that we can see then the columns, and we want to think about the variable names that we could use as temporary placeholders as we are utilizing our fscanf. And we also want to take just a second to think about the data types associated with these particular values. So to begin with, let's focus on our ID. We can come up here. We can simply create then a temporary local variable that we're going to call ID. I would encourage you to probably leave it the same size as the structure. So in this case, my ID is going to be 10. I'm going to do the same thing now with my name. And again, we're going to try to leave it the same size. I believe we had that as 20. Our type is also going to be a character vector or string with 20 elements in it. We have our description, which again is going to be a character vector. We're going to utilize it as a string. And then I have my price, which is going to be a double, and my quantity, which will be an integer. Now, at this point, we have variables that we can utilize in our fscanf. And what I'd like to do is essentially build this piece by piece. To start off with, I'm going to look at the first field, which is going to be a %s, or at least what I'm going to try to capture as a %s. And then follow that up with another %s, a third %s, a fourth %s, followed by a %lf, followed by a %d. And then inside of the fscanf function, we want to pass then the address for the variables, these temporary variables that we intended to use. The first one, of course, being the ID, the second one being the address of the name, third one being the address of the type, fourth one being the address of the description, fifth one being the address of the price, and then the last one being the address of the quantity. Now, at this point, we want to just simply test to see if this in fact works. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply try to print out the first field. And so in this case, I'm going to print F against my ID. And we need to go back now to our calling function to be able to trigger our import. So first thing, let's go ahead and build it. And then what we can do is in any of the branches in our main where we call our search. So for instance, we're going to start here with our calling of our /ID. We simply want to make a call now to our import function or import products. We can hard code for this particular example, our products.csv. Looking at our function signature, we'll note that we need to pass to it an array of structures. In this case, we can simply call this our products. And then we need to pass to it the address of an integer n. Now, we have not yet declared these variables, so why don't we come up here real quick. And we will create then a product properties structure called products, and we will make it the size of our n max. The other thing we want to do is create then a int n variable. And then one little change that we forgot to do in our import products is as we capture each of the lines in our file, we simply want to increment our n. And the idea is I just want to see if, in fact, I am successfully reading in the values and how many. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up here to my main, and I'm going to have a print statement, printf, %d, followed by a new line, and I'm simply going to print out whatever value is in my n. Now, let's go ahead and build this real quick. Let's go ahead and come out to our command window, and then let's run our search with our ID, and we have to provide it with some value. And you can see that my application is behaving weird. In other words, you'll notice here two things. Number one, as I've read in too much information into that first field. In other words, basically the ID was supposed to stop at the comma, but instead it included a bunch of additional characters, and specifically it stopped then after the sold. And so what has happened here is that my %s that I am using for my fscanf is in fact too greedy. The idea here is that we want it to continue to read up until the point that it finds a comma. But because we are using the %s space, excuse me, the %s format spec, it is in fact reading all the way up to the first space. In other words, it's going to stop by it with only when it reaches a non-character, it's only going to stop when it reaches a white space character. So in other words, it's basically at this point too greedy. So the other thing we'll notice real quick that it is causing a problem in that it is trying to put too many characters in our ID. Now, again, we're going to solve both of these problems at once. And more importantly, we need to come back out here to our command prompt, and we need to stop our application. Now, how do we fix this? Well, it turns out that if you do a little bit of digging into fscanf, there are a lot of options, including the ability to capture something up to a value or up to a character. In other words, basically what we want to do is we want to capture everything except a comma. And the syntax for that is actually pretty straightforward. We use a set of square brackets, and then inside of that square brackets, we basically say we want to capture everything except or not a comma. And each one of our %s's will simply become then effectively not comma. And so continuing on with this then for our fourth %s, and then lastly then for our fifth %s, or rather our fourth %s, got a few too many here, 1, 2, 3, 4 %s's. All of these will continue up until the point that they find a comma. So let's see how this changes the behavior. We'll rebuild this one more time. We'll come out here, we'll run it one more time, and you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm only capturing the ID. So at this point then, what we can do is we can capture the individual elements of our CSV file in our variables. And so let's try one more. Let's see if we've gotten this right. We're going to also look at our type. Let's go ahead and build this. And you can see that I'm able to capture not only my ID, but also the type and the name, and then so on. At this point, then what we want to do is we want to figure out how to actually store it in the structure that corresponds to the row or corresponds to our N. And it turns out that with the exception of the strings, it's pretty straightforward. And so we'll actually focus first on the price and quantity so you can understand what we're going to do, and then we will look at the string fields. And so to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to take our import results array. We're going to use the square brackets. We're going to use our N to keep track of which element we are trying to update in the array. We'll use our dot notation to update the price. So in other words, we can simply assign the value from the CSV file that we have read into our local price variable to the price field in the appropriate row in our structure array. Once again, to see how this works, we can do import results. We can now do the same thing with the quantity by leveraging this local variable. And essentially what we're doing is we're just simply copying this over field by field. Now, I mentioned the process for the strings is going to be a little less straightforward. It's not too terribly complicated. And your first impulse is probably going to be to do this here. The idea is that, let's say we have our ID is equal to our ID. Well, it turns out this won't work because we are going to be copying char pointers. And we can't do it that way. Instead, what we want to do is we want to use our string copy function to copy to our destination, in this case, our import results array, and specifically the ID field. And we want to copy the ID or that local variable, the contents of it, to our structures field. And so a little note here, must use string copy or copy char by char. Now, technically that will work. However, I'm just going to discourage you from doing that. You have to have a purpose for doing that if you intend to do that. All right, so one more time. We'll use our string copy. We're going to use our import results array. We will use the specific row in our import results array of structures. And in this case, we'll focus on the name. And we simply want to copy then whatever value we got out of the file into the appropriate field in that structure. And again, at this point, you can probably see the pattern. Matter of fact, a little bit of copying and pasting here. We'll do the same with the type. And lastly, the description. And now hopefully you can see why it's important to make sure that you have the right size variables, both in our import function as well as in the fields in the structures as well. Now, let's go ahead and get rid of or comment out that second printf. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea for us to just simply leave our printf in for the ID, just to sort of give us a good feeling that something is actually going on. And at this point, then we can just go ahead and build it. Run it once more. And you can see that not a lot is happening. However, we have successfully read in from the file and attempted to store into our array of structures. However, we don't know yet whether or not that is available to us in main. We do have our print statement that shows the number of rows we have read in. However, we do not know whether the fields in the array itself have in fact been updated. So let's go up here to our main and let's repeat the exact same thing we did inside of our function. In other words, once we have made a successful call to our function, so we can simply check to see if our import products is equal to exit success, then we simply want to print the number of rows. And then at this point, what we can do is we can set up a little for loop going up to, but not including the n, incrementing index plus plus. And what I'd like to do is then simply print one of the fields in our structure. So in this case, I'm going to use a %s followed by a new line. And I am again going to leverage, in this case, my products array and the index. And I'm going to look at the ID. So at this point, then let's go ahead and build this. And if we run this one more time, you'll see that I have in fact been successful at reading in the elements of the CSV file into the array of structures. Now, you're probably wondering a little bit about this extra line down here at the bottom. Well, it turns out that if you take a look at your products.csv, you'll notice that there is an extra new line, which we have to get rid of. In case you ever see this, then you just want to take just a second to remove that. That's just a byproduct of creating some of these or accessing these in Excel. And if you go back here to our command window and you run it one more time, you'll notice that that extra new line there at the bottom is now gone. And so at this point, then we have proven that we can successfully import the CSV file into an array of structures. And at this point, then we should be ready to go with actually manipulating then that array of structures. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.